Get out of here before I make you regret it." The words rang out sharp and dripping with disgust. Before Tanya could even process them fully, the cold water came. It hit her like a slap to the face, sudden, harsh, and dehumanizing. The water soaked her cap, streamed down her face, and drenched her white t-shirt. It pooled on the floor beneath her, leaving dark streaks on the cracked, dull tiles of the Harborview Police Department lobby. She stood still for a moment, stunned, but there was no scream, no anger, just a simmering, icy resolve. Tanya Brooks, disguised as Linda James, a simple, tired woman, had walked into the police station expecting disrespect. But this was something else entirely. This is not just a story. This is a mirror held up to the system, a system where the color of your skin and the size of your paycheck still decide whether you're treated with respect or thrown aside like nothing. Where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments, because this happens in cities, towns, and neighborhoods just like yours. Her cap, a faded navy blue baseball cap, frayed at the edges, slipped lower over her eyes as the water dripped down. The words, "my kind," echoed in her head. Words she'd heard far too often in places like this from people like Officer Tom Harlan. But she wasn't about to be broken by them. Tanya raised her head slowly, revealing eyes that had seen too much, felt too much, and now, at this moment, were colder than ever before. The officer who had thrown the water was still standing behind the tall oak counter, looking at her with a twisted grin on his face, holding the empty water bottle like some kind of trophy. "You've got a lot of nerve," Harlan said, his voice dripping with mockery. "You people always show up here making a scene. Go home before you make things worse." But Tanya wasn't backing down. Her eyes locked with his sharp unwavering, filled with an intensity that made him falter. "What exactly do you mean by 'my kind officer'?" The question sliced through the thick air in the lobby, freezing everything around them. Harlan's smirk faltered just for a second. It wasn't fear. No, it was something far more dangerous realization. She wasn't just any woman in the lobby today. Tanya wasn't just Linda James. She was the newly appointed chief of police for Harborview Undercover, on a mission to fix exactly what Officer Harlan represented: arrogance, abuse, and a system that overlooked people like her. She took another step forward, her soaked clothes clinging to her skin, but she stood tall, commanding, unyielding. "You've crossed a line, officer," she said, her voice steady cold, "and I'm not going anywhere until you answer for it." The room fell silent. People around them shifted uncomfortably in their seats, eyes wide breath held. They had seen it all, the slow erosion of trust, the disregard from those who swore to serve them. But this was different. Tanya was different. "I'm not leaving until you take responsibility," she said, her words hanging in the air like a challenge. "You think I'm just going to walk away humiliated? No." "This ends now." Harlan stood there flustered, unsure of how to handle the situation. For a moment his expression changed slightly, revealing something Tanya had been waiting for: doubt. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to make her believe that things could finally change. "What do you think Tanya will do next? Do you believe Officer Harlan is going to regret this? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to hit subscribe for more. The silence in the lobby was deafening. You could almost hear every drop of water hitting the floor. Tanya's soaked clothes clung to her skin, but it was her eyes that commanded the room. There was no hesitation, no faltering. Her gaze was razor-sharp, locking on Officer Harlan, who now stood behind the oak counter, visibly shaken. It was the first time he'd realized the gravity of the situation. He had assumed he could dismiss her, a woman dressed down in a worn cap and faded t-shirt, just another nuisance to push aside. But now he was the one backed into a corner. "What do you want, huh?" Harlan's voice broke through the tension, shaky, defensive. His eyes darted around the room, unsure of how to regain control. "This is the Harborview Police Department. I don't take orders from anyone, least of all people like you." Tanya's lips twitched, but only for a moment. She wasn't about to let this go. Not today. Not after everything she'd seen in this city. Years of mistreatment, the systemic discrimination that had been allowed to fester unchecked, this was her chance to make sure it ended. People, like me, Tanya, repeated her voice, rising slightly, but it was steady. No anger, just clarity. Her words echoed in the silence. "Let me remind you, Officer Harlan, I am the chief of police for this city, and you just assaulted me. That doesn't just get brushed under the rug." Harlan's face flushed a deep red. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the counter, staring at her. The smug confidence he had started with was now entirely gone, replaced with something raw and uncertain. The room seemed to tighten, everyone holding their breath, afraid to speak up, but watching with wide eyes, some secretly rooting for Tanya. People had long been afraid to stand up to the system, but Tanya was different. She was about to show them all how it could be done. "Look, I didn't mean—" Harlan stammered, his words faltering, but Tanya wasn't going to give him the luxury of explanation. Not now. "Didn't mean it." Tanya's voice dropped an octave, becoming colder. "That's what you always say, isn't it? You didn't mean it when you looked down on me. You didn't mean it when you belittled me because of my skin, because of my clothes, because you think that my kind doesn't belong here." She let the words hang in the air like smoke, their weight settling heavily between them. She could feel the tension in her own chest tightening, but she refused to let it show. Her every word was deliberate, calculated. This wasn't just about her. This was about every person who had ever been mistreated by someone in power. The other officers in the room watched, some with eyes full of curiosity, others with uncomfortable glances. The young officer in the corner still hadn't moved, but Tanya could feel his shame. She could almost hear the voice inside his head asking, "Why am I not doing something?" And then there was Harlan, whose mind seemed to be racing, caught in the flood of panic and pride. Tanya knew he wasn't used to this. He was used to throwing people around with his words, his badge, his power. But here now in front of her, his power was gone. The truth was staring him in the face. "You've crossed a line, Officer Harlan." Tanya said her words deliberate and final. "And now you're going to face the consequences." Harlan opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked around the room, desperately seeking validation, but no one came to his aid. They had all witnessed it. They had all seen the truth, the cruelty in his actions. And now there was no turning back. The door to the back office opened, and Sergeant Susan Grant, a middle-aged woman with stern eyes, stepped out. Her gaze flickering between Tanya and Harlan. She had heard the commotion, had likely seen the events unfold from her desk in the back. Her expression was unreadable, but Tanya could see the hesitation in her eyes. Sergeant Grant Tanya said, not breaking eye contact with Harlan, "I believe Officer Harlan here has made a serious mistake. I'd like to have a word with him alone." Susan Grant's lips pressed into a tight line, and Tanya could almost hear the thoughts racing through her mind. The situation was bigger than any of them, but Grant knew better than anyone that ignoring it now would only make things worse. Grant nodded, stepping aside, but not without a glance at Harlan, who was still trying to regain his composure. Tanya watched as the room held its breath, waiting for her next move. "Harlan," Tanya continued, her voice soft but heavy with authority, "you will be suspended immediately. You'll turn over your badge and gun. We will be investigating this incident, and I will personally ensure that it is handled fairly." Harlan's face went pale, his previous defiance crumbling like dust in the wind. His mouth moved, but words failed him. He opened his hands as if pleading for mercy, but there was no mercy here, not today. "You can't do this," he finally muttered, voice thick with panic. "I have a family. You should have thought about your family before you made me your target." Tanya interrupted, her voice hard. "Now, do yourself a favor and walk out the door with some dignity." Tanya's words hung in the air, colder than the water that had soaked her. The tension in the room was palpable, thick enough to suffocate anyone who wasn't ready to confront it. As Harlan stumbled backward, clearly broken, Tanya turned toward the group of officers, her eyes hardening. This is the beginning of change, and anyone who thinks they can get away with behavior like his will answer to me. The silence that followed was unlike anything she'd ever felt before. The room was no longer just a waiting area. It was a battlefield, a turning point. The room had gone eerily quiet, the tension almost suffocating. Tanya stood tall, drenched and unwavering as Officer Harlan stumbled backward, his face pale with fear and disbelief. His previous arrogance had melted away, leaving behind a shell of a man who realized too late the depth of his mistake. Harlan's pleas still echoed in the silence. "Please, I didn't mean it." His voice cracked, a sharp contrast to the aggression he had shown just moments ago. But Tanya wasn't moved. Her eyes were colder than the water that had soaked her through. "That's the problem," Tanya said, her voice low but filled with unrelenting force. "You never mean it, do you? You never mean it when you discriminate, when you disrespect, when you abuse your power." She paused, letting the words sink into the room like a heavy stone dropped in still water. "But here's the truth, Officer Harlan. It doesn't matter whether you meant it. What matters is that you did it." The words hit Harlan like a punch to the gut. He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. His posture slumped even more, as if the weight of his actions was finally catching up to him. Tanya turned to Sergeant Susan Grant, her voice now controlled but edged with finality. "Sergeant Grant, please escort Officer Harlan to the back. He will remain suspended, pending an internal investigation. I'll handle the formalities." Grant nodded, her expression a mix of confusion and concern, but she did as she was told. She walked toward Harlan, who remained rooted to the spot, his body trembling, his eyes full of a silent desperation. As Grant led him away, Tanya couldn't help but wonder how many others like Harlan had hidden behind the badge, their actions cloaked in authority, unchecked for years. But Tanya wasn't going to let it slide. Not anymore. As the door to the back office clicked shut behind Harlan, the remaining officers in the lobby stood, frozen eyes darting from Tanya to each other, unsure of what to do next. Tanya knew she had their attention now, but the hard work was only just beginning. Tanya walked to the counter, her boots clicking softly against the tile floor, each step purposeful. She leaned over, her gaze sweeping over the room. Every pair of eyes in the room was on her now, and she could feel their uncertainty, their fear, their hope, all tangled up in one. They knew that change was coming, but they didn't know how or if they could survive it. "I want to make something clear," Tanya said, her voice steady, unwavering. "What just happened here is not an isolated incident. Officer Harlan's actions are a reflection of a much deeper problem in this department, and I will root it out, every last piece of it." The words hung in the air, thick with the weight of their meaning. Tanya wasn't just addressing the officers in the room. She was speaking to the entire department, to every officer who had let things slide for too long, to every citizen who had suffered under a broken system. "We will not be a department that tolerates discrimination or abuse of power," Tanya continued. "We will not be a department that looks the other way when people in positions of authority treat others like they don't matter. This is not just about one officer. This is about all of us, every single one of you. And if you want to stay, if you want to be a part of this team, you need to understand that you're either part of the solution or part of the problem." The room remained silent, the weight of Tanya's words pressing down on each officer like a 1,000-pound weight. No one moved. No one dared to speak. Tanya could see it in their eyes, the realization that things were about to change and that their complacency would no longer be tolerated. But that wasn't all. Tanya wasn't done. She was just getting started. She turned back to Sergeant Grant, her voice cool and commanding. "I need a full report on Officer Harlan's history. Any previous complaints, any signs of misconduct, anything that even hints at this kind of behavior. I want it on my desk by the end of the day." Grant hesitated for just a moment, but Tanya's unyielding gaze left no room for argument. Grant nodded, turning to leave. As she walked away, Tanya let out a slow, controlled breath. She had to stay calm. She couldn't let the anger that churned in her gut take over. There was too much at stake now. She had a city to save. But the truth was, Tanya wasn't just fighting for the city. She was fighting for herself, for the countless others who had been silenced, for the people who had been told time and time again that they didn't matter. And now, she was going to make sure they did matter. Tanya turned to the group of officers in the lobby, her voice lowering but still firm. "This is your chance to be part of something real. to make a difference. You'll have to prove it, though. Actions speak louder than words." The officers shifted uncomfortably. Tanya could see it in their eyes. They weren't sure if they could change or if they even wanted to. But Tanya wasn't going to wait for them to decide. She was going to force the change. The door to the back office opened and Sergeant Grant emerged. Tanya looked up, her expression steely. "I'm going to make sure Harlan's actions are exposed," Tanya said. "But this is just the beginning." The words settled in the room like a bomb. Every officer in the lobby, frozen in their seats, felt the intensity of the moment. Tanya's gaze swept across them, each of them, from the young officer in the corner, who had been too afraid to speak, to Sergeant Grant, who had watched the entire exchange with a careful, almost cautious eye. Tanya wasn't just talking about Harlan anymore. No, this wasn't just about a single bad apple. This was about the whole rotten barrel, and Tanya had no intention of letting the system get away with it any longer. "Harlan is just a symptom." Tanya continued, her voice now low-measured. "But the disease is deeper than that. I'm going to make sure you all understand this." The silence in the room was deafening. It was as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Tanya wasn't just speaking to Harlan anymore. She was speaking to every officer here, every one of them who had either turned a blind eye or tolerated the injustices that ran rampant within their ranks. "You think what Harlan did was an isolated incident?" Tanya's voice grew colder, more direct. "You think he's the only one who's ever treated people like that? Dismissed their pain, their humanity, because they don't look like him? You think the system just accidentally let that happen?" Her words didn't just hang in the air. They punched, they slapped, they demanded to be felt. Tanya was in no mood to spare feelings. She wasn't here to make friends. She was here to fix a broken system, even if it meant breaking down the walls first. Tanya stepped away from the counter and slowly walked toward the back door of the lobby, her boots clicking on the tile floor with each deliberate step. The officers who had been watching her began to shift uncomfortably, their eyes darting between each other. They could feel the tension building, the moment of reckoning just around the corner. She turned back toward them, her gaze steady, unyielding. "This city has suffered long enough," Tanya said, the weight of her words pulling at the heartstrings of everyone in the room. "People have suffered in silence, and I'm done letting that happen." Her words cut through the air with an almost palpable force. You could feel the anger rising inside her, the years of watching people like her being treated like second-class citizens, the endless stories of injustice that never saw the light of day. She was here to change that. She was here to rip off the veil of complacency. "Tomorrow morning," Tanya said, her voice calm, but the fire behind it unmistakable. "I'm holding a meeting with all officers. Every last one of you will be in that room, and we will talk about what just happened here. We will talk about what you are doing to help fix this. If you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. Understand?" No one dared answer, but the tension was thick. It was as if Tanya had just challenged the very foundation of what these officers had believed for years. They weren't ready for this, none of them were. They were used to letting things slide, used to maintaining the status quo, used to dismissing complaints as nothing more than the ramblings of troublemakers. But now there was a reckoning, and it had Tanya's name all over it. "Officer Grant," Tanya said, her gaze now softening just slightly. "I need you to stay behind. We need to go over some things: Harlan's file, the complaints against him, everything. I'm going to need you to start preparing for tomorrow's meeting. You're going to help me set the tone." Grant hesitated, her face tight with something Tanya couldn't quite read. But after a moment, she nodded. "Understood, Chief." As Sergeant Grant retreated to the back office, Tanya stood in the center of the lobby, looking around at the officers left behind. Their faces told stories, some of discomfort, some of fear, some of uncertainty. But there was also something else. She saw a flicker of hope. She had their attention now. She knew it. She could feel it. This wasn't just about punishing one officer. This was about forcing everyone in this room to face the truth they'd been avoiding for so long. Tanya walked slowly to the door, her footsteps echoing in the empty lobby. As she reached for the handle, she turned back one last time, her voice carrying over her shoulder. "This department will change. You will change, whether you want to or not." With that, she stepped out, leaving the officers in a thick silence, their minds racing, their hearts heavy. Tanya Brooks had just set the course for the hardest journey any of them would ever face, and it was only just beginning. The sun was barely rising the next morning as Tanya Brooks sat at her desk staring at the screen in front of her. The dim light from the window cast long shadows across the room, but Tanya didn't notice. She had a job to do, and there was no time for distractions. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she pulled up Officer Harlan's file. Every complaint, every missed opportunity to address his behavior, every overlooked red flag. It was all there, buried in the department's dusty archives, hidden behind a facade of discipline that had never really been enforced. She clicked through the documents, each page more damning than the last. Rudeness, disrespect, bias against people of color. His file was a textbook example of how systemic failures fester when they're allowed to go unchecked. Tanya's stomach tightened. The same story, over and over. She could feel the weight of every page she scrolled through, each one a reminder of how many times people had been harmed because no one had been willing to do something about it. She leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes for a moment, letting the silence fill the room. The stillness felt heavy, oppressive, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was staring down the barrel of something much larger than she had anticipated. Harlan's actions were only one piece of the puzzle. The real question was how far this problem went. How deep did the rot run? Just then, the door to her office creaked open and Sergeant Grant stepped inside, her expression unreadable. Tanya didn't need to ask if she had the file. Grant was holding it out in her hands before Tanya even looked up. "We've got a problem," Grant said, her voice tight, betraying just a hint of the stress that was already weighing on her. She handed over a thick stack of papers and Tanya immediately began flipping through them. The deeper she dove into Harlan's history, the more the bile in her throat rose. It wasn't just Harlan. It was the whole department. Complaints about racial profiling, verbal abuse, unjustified use of force. Tanya had suspected as much, but seeing it all laid out before her made the reality hit like a freight train. "Who else knew about this?" Tanya asked, her voice steady but full of the quiet anger that had been building inside her for years. Grant shifted uncomfortably. "Most of the command staff. But you know how it is. People look the other way, or worse, they cover it up." Tanya's fingers clenched around the file. She could feel her jaw tightening, her teeth gritting as the injustice of it all sank in. This wasn't just about one bad cop. This was about a culture that had allowed this kind of behavior to persist unchecked. A culture that had protected the perpetrators and sacrificed the victims. "That's it, isn't it?" Tanya said almost to herself. "This is what happens when a system is designed to fail." Grant stayed silent, her eyes flickering to the floor. It was clear she understood exactly what Tanya meant. This wasn't just about fixing one officer or cleaning up one department. This was about dismantling an entire culture of corruption, silence, and power abuse. Tanya let out a slow breath. "We're going to expose all of it," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "We'll get the internal affairs team to work through everything. We're not stopping at Harlan." Grant looked up at her, a spark of something resembling hope in her eyes. "You really think we can do this?" Tanya didn't hesitate. "We don't have a choice." She stood up, her mind racing with the implications of what she was about to do. Harlan wasn't the only one who needed to be held accountable. There were others, officers who had been complicit supervisors who had failed to act, and a system that had turned a blind eye to the suffering of its citizens. Tanya felt the weight of their eyes on her, the eyes of the officers she had to lead, the community she had to protect, and most of all, the eyes of the people who had suffered in silence for so long. "Prepare the reports. We're making this public. I want the media involved." Tanya said, her tone firm. She could feel the shift in the room, the quiet acknowledgement that this wasn't just a typical internal investigation. This was a public reckoning. Grant nodded, but Tanya could see the flicker of fear in her eyes. This wasn't going to be easy. The fight she was about to wage would be long, brutal, and messy. It would expose the ugly truths about the department, and some people wouldn't be ready to face them. But Tanya wasn't backing down. She couldn't. She had seen too much, heard too many stories of injustice, and she had lived through too many years of discrimination to let this go unnoticed. She had made a promise to herself and to the people who trusted her that she would bring real change, no matter what it cost her. "Get the team together," Tanya ordered, turning back toward her desk, her mind already moving ahead to the next steps. "We're going to fix this, once and for all." Grant hesitated for a moment before nodding and walking out of the room, leaving Tanya alone with the weight of her decision. The road ahead was going to be difficult, no one could deny that. But Tanya knew one thing for sure: the battle for justice wasn't over yet. It had only just begun, and this time she was going to win. Tanya stared at the city skyline through her office window, the early morning light reflecting off the glass. The streets were quiet, almost peaceful, but she knew deep down that this facade of calm wouldn't last long. It was only a matter of time before the storm hit, and she was preparing herself to face it head-on. She turned away from the window and looked back at the reports spread out on her desk. The weight of it all was suffocating. The complaints against Harlan were only the beginning. Tanya knew there were many more like him, officers with deep-seated prejudices. Commanders who had turned a blind eye and a broken system that had tolerated this behavior for far too long. The door to her office creaked open, and Sergeant Grant stepped inside. Her face, pale eyes wide with the kind of tension that only grew stronger with each passing moment. Tanya didn't need to ask what was on her mind. She could see it. "They're talking," Grant said, her voice tight, almost breathless. "The media's getting wind of Harlan's suspension, and they're starting to ask questions. Big questions." Tanya's pulse quickened, but her expression remained calm, almost cold. She'd known this day was coming, the day when her decision to expose the truth would no longer be something contained within the walls of the department. The world was about to see everything that had been hidden, buried, and ignored for years. "Let them ask," Tanya replied, her voice steady but sharp. "Let them see what's been happening in this department for far too long. The truth isn't something we should be hiding, it's something we should be shouting from the rooftops." Grant swallowed, her eyes darting nervously to the door. "You don't think they'll try to cover it up, do you? Do you? The higher-ups, the ones who've been protecting him?" Tanya stood up from her desk, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. She met Grant's eyes with an unwavering stare. "They can try, but I'll make sure they know that the truth has a way of coming out whether they like it or not." Grant hesitated, the weight of the situation sinking in. "But what if they try to turn the tables? What if they make it look like you're the one who's out of line?" Tanya's lips curled into a grim smile. She'd expected this kind of pushback. They weren't going to let her dismantle their precious status quo without a fight. But that didn't matter. She was ready for it. Let them try. They can spin it however they want. I'm not backing down. The tension in the room thickened. Tanya knew that once the media caught wind of this story, there would be no going back. They would pick it apart, turning over every stone, every small detail in search of a scandal. And the pressure from the top, the political pressure, the pressure from the city's elite, the ones who had been protecting these officers, would only grow stronger. But Tanya didn't care. She'd fought for justice before, and she wasn't about to stop now. "I need to move fast," Tanya said, her voice firm, a note of determination creeping into her words. "We're going to expose every last piece of this Harlan's actions, the cover-ups, the systemic issues. We'll show the public what they've been turning a blind eye to for years." Grant nodded, but Tanya could see the worry in her eyes. She understood. There was so much at stake now, but the truth was even more important than their fears. "What's the plan?" Grant asked, her voice quieter now, as if the enormity of it all had finally hit her. "We need to get the evidence out in the open," Tanya replied, pacing slowly back and forth. "We've got the internal files on Harlan. We've got the media on our side. But we need more. We need testimonies, we need proof from those who've been silenced, from the people who've been ignored. I'm not going to let Harlan be the only one to fall." Grant paused for a moment, processing the weight of Tanya's words. Then she spoke, her voice low, but filled with resolve. I'll start gathering statements. I'll talk to the witnesses, anyone who has evidence. But, Tanya, you know this won't be easy. The pushback is going to come hard. And it'll come fast. Tanya turned to face her locking eyes with her sergeant. I know, but we don't have a choice anymore. We can't keep hiding from this. We have to fight. Grant nodded, her expression shifting. There was fear, yes, but there was something else too, something that Tanya hadn't seen before, hope. Hope that they could actually do something about the mess that had plagued their department for so long. As Grant left the room to start working on her part, Tanya sat back down at her desk, her mind already moving to the next step. She had a lot of work ahead of her, and the road would be long and hard. But Tanya was prepared. The truth had its own power, and right now she was wielding it like a weapon. She picked up the phone and dialed the number for the media team. She had made her decision. There was no turning back now. This was going to be bigger than just Harlan. This was about the future of the department, the future of Harborview. This was about changing the culture once and for all. And no matter what it took, Tanya was going to see it through. The truth had a way of cutting through the darkness, and Tanya was ready to make sure it was heard. The real fight was just beginning. Tanya sat in her office, the hum of the fluorescent lights the only sound in the room. The adrenaline from the press conference was starting to wear off, but the weight of what she had just started pressed down on her shoulders. The truth was out. It was no longer a matter of if the department would change, it was a matter of how far the change would go and who would try to stop it. The door creaked open. Sergeant Grant stepped inside, her face tight with tension. Tanya didn't need to ask what was going on. She could already feel the storm that was brewing, the resistance that was sure to come. The last thing Tanya needed was to have her own people turn on her, but she also knew that change always came with a price. "We've got a problem," Grant said, her voice tense. Tanya didn't flinch. "What's going on? The backlash is coming in fast. The mayor's office just called. They're putting pressure on us to retract the statements. They want you to stop the investigation. They're calling it a media circus, saying it's creating more chaos than it's worth." Tanya felt the anger building inside her, but she kept her expression neutral. She had known this would happen. The powerful people who had been protecting the system were now scrambling to maintain control. But it didn't matter. Tanya had made her choice. She was not backing down. "You know I'm not going to stop," Tanya said, her voice cold and firm. "This isn't about media. This is about exposing the truth, and if they think they can silence me, they're wrong." Grant hesitated, the weight of the situation clearly on her shoulders. "They're scared, Tanya. You're rattling the cage and they don't like it. They're going to make this a political issue. It's not just the department at risk, it's your career." Tanya stared at her for a long moment, processing her words. She knew the stakes. She knew the consequences, but she wasn't afraid. "Not anymore. I didn't come here to protect my career. I came here to fix this department," Tanya said, her voice unwavering. "If they want to make it political, then let them. But I'm going to keep going. I've seen too much, and I'm not stopping now." Grant sighed, clearly frustrated, but also resigned. "I know, but you need to be careful. People are watching. If you go after the wrong people, it's not just going to be Harlan. It's going to be everyone who's been protecting him." Tanya stood up, her mind already working through the next steps. "I'm not going after anyone. I'm going after the truth. I want to expose everything, the cover-ups, the corruption, the way people like Harlan have been allowed to abuse their power for years. And if they think they can bury that, they're gravely mistaken." Grant nodded slowly, understanding that there was no stopping Tanya now. "You've got my support. I'll help however I can." Tanya gave her a firm nod. "I know you will. Now, we need to get ready. The media is already on our tail, and we need to stay one step ahead." Grant turned to leave, but paused at the door. "Be careful, Tanya. This is bigger than just one officer. You know that, right?" Tanya met her gaze, her eyes filled with resolve. "I know, but if we don't face it now, it's just going to get worse, and I won't let that happen." The next few days were a whirlwind. Tanya's every move was being scrutinized by the press, and the department was on high alert. She had expected the pushback, but it came harder and faster than she had anticipated. Calls came in from city officials demanding that she drop the investigation, telling her that she was making a mess of things. But Tanya refused to budge. She knew this fight wasn't just about exposing Harlan. It was about breaking down the walls of corruption that had been allowed to stand for so long. It was about telling the truth no matter how uncomfortable it was for the people in power, and that meant facing the consequences head-on. One evening, Tanya sat alone in her office, the room dimly lit by the city's lights outside her window. Her phone rang, breaking the silence. She picked it up without hesitation. Tanya, the voice on the other end, said calm but tense. "You need to stop this. This is bigger than you think. You don't know what you're dealing with." Tanya's heart skipped a beat. She recognized the voice. It was someone from the mayor's office, a voice that had once been supportive, but now there was an edge to it. "I'm not stopping," Tanya said, her voice hard. "I've already made it clear that I'm seeing this through. You're walking into a storm, Tanya. The higher-ups are already making plans to discredit you. They'll destroy everything you've worked for. They've already started turning the media against you." Tanya's jaw tightened. "Let them. The truth doesn't change just because they don't like it. I'm not backing down." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "You're making a huge mistake, but if you're determined to do this, then I suggest you be ready for what comes next." Tanya ended the call, her mind racing. She had known that this fight would come with consequences, but now it was clear they were going to stop at nothing to maintain control, and she was ready for it. She looked out the window, the city skyline spread out before her. Tanya had made a decision. She wasn't just going to expose the corruption in the department. She was going to bring the whole system down. She wasn't afraid of the fight ahead. The truth had been unleashed, and now she would make sure it tore down every wall that had been built to protect those who had abused their power for far too long. The days that followed were nothing short of a storm. Tanya had expected pushback, but not with this level of force. The department was on edge with the media constantly circling and internal pressure rising by the hour. The higher-ups had begun a full-blown campaign to discredit her using every tool at their disposal to shift the narrative in their favor. Tanya knew they wouldn't go down without a fight, but this time they were the ones on the defensive. She stood before the city council, the air thick with tension. The room was packed with reporters, politicians, and civilians, their eyes trained on her as she prepared to deliver the final blow. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, but there was no fear. Not now. The truth had been laid bare, and it was time to finish what she had started. As she took the podium, Tanya's mind flashed back to that first moment, the moment when Harlan poured water on her head, thinking he could get away with it. That one act of blatant disrespect had been the spark, and now here she was about to ignite something far greater. "I've told you the truth." Tanya began, her voice unwavering, every word clear and deliberate. "The Harborview Police Department has been broken for far too long. Corruption, abuse of power, and racial discrimination have been allowed to fester within these walls, and I will not stand by and let it continue." Her words hung in the air, challenging everyone in the room to face the truth. The tension was almost unbearable, but Tanya stood strong, resolute in the face of the storm. She had been tested, pushed to her limits, but now she was the one in control. We've seen the consequences of silence. We've seen the damage done when the system is allowed to protect the wrong people. "And it stops here," Tanya continued. "This investigation isn't just about exposing one officer. It's about ensuring that those who have abused their power are held accountable, that those who have been wronged are finally heard. It's about making sure that this city, this department serves the people, not the powerful." She could feel the weight of the eyes upon her, some with disbelief, others with anger. She knew the fight wasn't over, but she was ready for it. As she paused to let the gravity of her words settle, she noticed the shifting in the room. Some of the council members were visibly uncomfortable, but others, those who had been waiting for a moment like this, seemed to be nodding in agreement. The wheels were turning. The truth was spreading, and the system was starting to crack. "I've made a promise to this city," Tanya said, her voice growing firmer. "A promise to make things right. To fix a broken system no matter how many people try to stop me. and I will keep that promise no matter the cost." She took a deep breath, allowing herself a brief moment of relief. But she wasn't done yet. She had one final message to deliver. This department will change. The people who have been protecting the corrupt will face the consequences, and the people of Harborview will see that justice is no longer a privilege for the few, it is a right for all. Tanya paused, her eyes scanning the room, locking onto the faces of the council members, the reporters, and the officers in the back. She knew the fight wasn't over. There would be those who would resist. But now the battle had a face, and it was hers. The press conference that followed was a turning point. The story was out, and there was no turning back. Tanya's fight had just begun, but in that moment it was clear that the old ways could not survive. The truth had been told, and with it the first crack in the foundation of corruption that had held the department together for so long. Tanya had faced the storm, had weathered the backlash, and stood firm in her conviction. She knew that change would take time and the road ahead would not be easy. But the victory was not in this one moment. The victory was in the truth, in the people who now saw their voices mattered, in the realization that justice was not something they had to beg for. It was something they could demand. This battle was far from over, but Tanya Brooks had set the stage for a revolution in Harborview. She had fought for what was right, no matter the cost. And in doing so, she had reminded everyone, herself included, that the fight for justice is never easy, but it is always worth it. Justice isn't just about the big moments. It's about fighting for what's right in every moment, no matter how hard it gets. And when we stand up to the forces of corruption, when we speak the truth, we give others the strength to do the same. It's never too late to demand justice. The truth is unstoppable.